The federal election campaign continues with all kinds of big promises to the Canadian public. But are these promises within our budget, and how will they affect our economy? Dr. Trevor Tombe, Associate Professor of Economics at the University of Calgary, joins me right now. Trevor, let's start with the differing taxation plans. The Liberals announced they'll not tax the first $15,000 of income, and the Tories will lower the income tax bracket to 13.75%. They seem like very similar plans, but actually framed a little differently.
Yeah, so they are quite similar in terms of their overall size. So they both represent income tax reductions of about 6 billion, a little bit less than 6 billion once they're fully phased in. But there are some important differences between them. So the Conservative proposal to lower that tax rate on the first bracket, that really does benefit every income tax payer in the country because we all pay at least in a little bit in that first bracket. The Liberal one differs, though, by increasing the amount of income that you can earn tax-free. That also benefits almost all income tax filers, but there's a little extra nuance there where if you're a single earning family, for example, you can also claim your spouse's basic amount. Or if you're a single parent, you can also claim a kid as equivalent to spouse. So there are some differences that affect families in different ways.
Now, the NDP plan is to increase taxes on wealthy Canadians. How will this actually work out in the long term?
Yeah, this one is, I think, a unique proposal that I find a little concerning. They're proposing to increase or to introduce a wealth tax of 1% on wealth over 20 million. And so that, what concerns me there is that it's fairly easy to move financial investments around across jurisdictions. So the real risk there is that it might lead to some capital flight out of Canada. And the Parliamentary Budget Office was pretty clear that that represents a big source of uncertainty around exactly how much revenue that tax would bring in.
Now, the Green Party would increase corporate taxes from 15 to 21% and would also place a special tax on bank profits. How will that actually impact the economy, Trev?
That's right. So increasing corporate taxes would turn Canada in the other direction from what we've seen historically here over the last few years and what we saw in the United States. And investors do look to the after-tax rate of return on a project. So if you're trying to decide whether to invest in this project or that project, you want to know how much you're going to get from that at the end of the day after taxes. So an increase in the corporate rate will tend to discourage employment. And a tax on financial transactions could have particularly negative consequences for the banking system. So I think those are probably, the Green Party tax proposals are probably the worst, I'd say, is fair for the overall economy in Canada.
Affordable housing seems to be a real issue as well, a party platform. Do they have a plan that would actually improve the housing market?
Yeah, housing affordability is a complicated issue because different cities, different provinces experience this issue in different ways. I mean, Calgary and Edmonton actually have pretty affordable real estate, Lethbridge as well, but Vancouver, Toronto, there in those markets, it takes a pretty significant amount of your income to afford owning a home. So for federal policy to play a role, it's really hard because different parts of the country experience it in different ways. So I think we should look less to the federal government and more to municipalities and zoning and ask how city governments can potentially increase housing supply in those cities. Some of the minor things that might affect things on the margin include the Conservatives proposing to increase the length of time that you can hold a mortgage from 25 to 30 years. And that will have the effect of lowering payments each month, making housing more affordable, although it does come at the cost of more interest that you pay as a mortgage holder over the life of that mortgage.
Okay, let's talk now about healthcare. The NDP and the Green Party promised to have universal national pharmacare, including dental, in place by the year 2020. The cost would be enormous. Now, where would the funds come from, and how would this really impact the annual federal budget and overall deficit, Trevor?
Yeah, great question. And first, let's get a sense of scale. So your average Canadian or Canada as a whole spends about $1,000 per person on drugs. We're talking about $30 to $35 billion. Now, some of that is already paid by government. So what we're really talking about is incrementally increasing government spending by about $20 billion. So that's significant. And the two parties have not been clear about how they would pay for it. And so you could imagine increasing the GST. How much would you have to increase it by to fund a program of that scale? by about 3% or so. So we'd have to go from 5 to 8. And if you didn't want to raise revenue through tax increases to fund that spending, then yeah, it would contribute to the deficit and debt over time. So I think it's a proposal certainly worth talking about, but in the context of how are you going to pay for it? And that's not exactly the conversation we're having at the moment.
There have been some major promises on climate change as well. Let's start with the carbon tax, which will be going up. How will this really impact our economy?
Yeah, so there's estimates on that from the federal government. So we have a carbon tax in some of the backstop provinces of Saskatchewan, Manitoba, Ontario, and New Brunswick. Alberta, depending on how the election goes, would see that in January. And estimates are that each $10 per ton that you increase that carbon tax by, overall Canadian GDP growth might be about 0.1% lower. So that accumulates through time. So maybe the economy by 2022 would be about 0.4% lower. So there is a negative consequence of the carbon tax, although I'd note that any action to lower emissions is going to come with a cost, and that there's really no free lunch here. And so we should be evaluating policies in terms of their cost effectiveness and how cheaply they can lower emissions. And some proposals are more expensive than others.
So apparently, the Green Party is promising to basically stop any further expansion of the oil and gas industry and replace it with green technology. They say this will create a whole bunch of new jobs, but how do you see it?
Yeah, so I would like to see the analysis, I guess, that led them to that conclusion. I suspect it is more of a talking point. Certainly, there are employment opportunities in R&D and in renewable power and so on, and the government has a role to support research and development in those type of activities. But to just stop expansion of oil and gas completely is a really high cost way to lower emissions. I mean, we generate significant value from this sector. It's roughly 10% of Canadian GDP as a whole, employing over 250,000 people, it not counting any of the indirect jobs. So what we should do is, I think, use the value in that industry in order to pay for things like R&D and indeed renewable power. So to shut down that sector is quite a costly way to go, and I'd say for the Green Party, counterproductive to their environmental goals.
So which party do you think has the most economically sound climate change plan?
So I'm actually a fan of carbon taxes in general, if the revenue is used to lower other taxes, and we don't pile on top of the carbon tax additional regulations that tend to distort economic activity. So it doesn't look, from my perspective, that any of the parties are promoting what an economist would say is the ideal climate plan. And so I think that's a problem, and I was sort of hoping for a little bit more on that front.
With all of the grand election promises, we see the federal leaders out there right now campaigning from coast to coast to coast. At what point would we see a return to a balanced federal budget? We'll be back in black.
So that's a good question. And in fairness to the parties, the campaign is still going on and they still have announcements to make. And none of the major parties have put out their full fiscal plan yet. So I really do look forward to seeing that so that I can answer a question like that. But the Conservatives in the past have committed to balancing over 5 years. And so that, even though they're lowering revenue with tax rate reductions, that can be achieved just with slower growth of spending over those 5 years.
It appears that a lot of voters don't really put reducing the federal deficit as a high priority. It's more the economy, healthcare, education, seniors issues. But should they?
So I tend to put a lot of weight on the deficit, and I think we should have a balanced budget when the economy is not in recession. And Canada's economy as a whole, Alberta's somewhat of a separate story, but Canada's economy as a whole is doing fairly well. And so we shouldn't see a federal deficit in that sense. But far be it from me to tell voters what they should and shouldn't consider high priorities. It's quite clear, though, that all the parties are responding to that. Even the Conservatives, a 5-year plan to balance is actually a fairly long time, given the relatively modest scale of the deficit currently.
A number of parties have promised to lower those cell phone bills. Can governments actually do this in a way that wouldn't hinder the free market economy?
Yeah, so they can, in principle, in that Canada does have a fairly protected telecommunications market. So not just cell phones, but we restrict entry from foreign companies, for example. And if we allowed a little more competition in the market, then like most markets, competition could drive lower costs. That's not really what's being proposed here by the parties. So the NDP and the Liberals have proposed moving on cell phone plans. The NDP just with price caps. And while that would certainly lower prices, I think it would adversely affect the amount of investment that those companies make, and that would affect quality and coverage and so on. And then the Liberals have been a little vaguer in terms of what they want to do, but they want to increase the ability of companies to piggyback on the larger carriers' network and access that network at wholesale prices. So maybe introducing competition at the retail side of the market. And that might do something at the margin. I'm not sure if it'll do the 25% reduction in cell phone prices that they're suggesting.
Trevor, how about education? Some parties are promising to have free post-secondary education. Don't tell my kids that. My son graduated with a huge student loan. Now, that's a huge cost. I mean, if you want to make post-secondary free, can this be funded in such a way without increasing our debt load?
So to give you a sense of scale, if we were to make tuition free, and here the Parliamentary Budget Office did cost that campaign promise, that would be about $10 billion per year. So in terms of GST points, it would be about 1 to 1.5 points on the GST. So it is a significant increase in spending. It's certainly something that it is feasible if we were willing to increase tax rates in order to pay for it. But I'm not quite sure that's something we should be doing. I mean, the education that I think students receive at many of the fine universities in the country is worth the relatively modest tuition. And in addition, this is a provincial matter. Post-secondary education is the jurisdiction of the provinces. And so I'm not entirely sure why a federal party would be proposing this measure.
Not just the tuition, but the books too. I remember when I graduated from Montreal College, now university, where you are, back in 1988. I mean, even back then, my books were $200, $250 per book. So, yeah.
Well, that's a bargain at twice the price, the knowledge and skills that you get here, hopefully.
Yeah, exactly. Amen to that. Any final words of advice to voters? What should we really be looking for in the economic promises from the federal parties?
Well, I think actually this campaign has seen a lot of policy promises. So that's good in the sense that there's a lot for voters to digest. So I'd really encourage people to ask questions at the door, go on to not just the party websites, but independent websites like the Parliamentary Budget Office to see how much different campaign promises cost and how parties are hoping to pay for them.
Dr. Trevor Tombe, Associate Professor of Economics at the U of C, thanks a lot for your time today.
Thank you for having me.
On behalf of all of us here at PCN, I'm Hal Roberts. God bless, and thanks so much for watching.